This is part 2, and in this video I will be talking about the .357 Magnum and the body armor of the 1920s and 30s. Modern American Rifleman article states that the reason that the FBI obtained .38 Supers and .357 Magnums was because these calibers were better able to penetrate through car bodies and the steel plate body armor used by the gangsters of this era. Another modern magazine states that the bulletproof vests of this era were easily penetrated by the .38 Super. Given what I've read from various sources, including news articles, I would say that the vests were more of a concern than the automobiles. After all, they were made to stop bullets, and they had the effect of emboldening criminals who would not want to risk a shootout with police. It specifically says that when the .38 Super came out, the bulletproof vest no longer offered protection. This is wrong in at least 3 different ways. The vast majority of law enforcement and criminals were still using .45 caliber pistols and .38 specials, which could still be stopped by a vest. Second of all, powerful .38 ACP ammunition, which was on par with .38 Super ammo, seemed to have already been made available. Third, more powerful weapons like .30-06 rifles already existed, and they could obviously defeat armor made to stop pistol rounds. Because of significant errors like this, we are right to be skeptical about the accuracy of modern sources that comment on the past. I've noticed that none of the discussion around this topic really goes into any kind of detail what the thickness of metal is involved in the case of body armor or automobile bodies. The automobile body, like the door panels, roof, etc., is obviously thinner than the structural frame of the vehicle. Testing done in American Rifleman magazine in 1935 mentioned that the frames of cars back then were made out of metal 1/16 of an inch thick. The .38 Special Peters ammunition metal-pointed bullet penetrated through 2 pieces of 1/16 inch thick car frame and deeply dented the 3rd piece on the far side of the car. The .38 Special Super X metal-capped bullet penetrated through 2 strips of 1/16 inch car frame, then another 2 strips on the opposite side of the car, and then finally through a 3/4 inch yellow pine board. This is a result of a relatively light 150 grain bullet at a relatively high velocity that has a copper cap designed to penetrate through metal. Related to this subject, we also have someone talking about a .38-44 Remington cartridge made with a copper tip to penetrate metal. He states that this ammunition will not penetrate an armored body. He also clarifies that many of the leading gangsters at this time were using vehicles lined with boilerplate and that only a high-power rifle would be of value against this kind of armor. I have no reason to take his opinion at face value, and I doubt whether he would be in a position to state what kind of bullet resistance a gangster's vehicle would have. After all, to speak with absolute certainty on this matter would require you to have personal experience or at least a news article that gave a very detailed description of a specific event. After looking through some of the news articles of this period, none of them seem to provide that kind of detail. His general perspective about firearms is overly simplistic and flawed in my opinion. I say this because he feels the need to portray those who would use a .250 Savage to hunt deer as morally lacking and callous because they are supposedly inevitably going to wound the deer and not outright kill it. This sort of logic reflects a perspective that is too simplistic to deal with nuance. Trying to get an in-depth understanding of the type of body armor used in the 1920s and 30s is rather difficult. There were multiple manufacturers making types of body armor at the time, and there weren't any industry standards for threat rating like we have today. This is an excerpt from an article written in 1924 about a body armor salesman who was unharmed after being shot 5 times by a robber. Bernard Spooner works for the American Armor Corporation. He mentions that their armor stops the .763 Mauser, the 9mm Luger, and the .45 Army Colt. I would assume that he means .45 Long Colt, but the wording is somewhat ambiguous and he could mean .45 ACP. Regardless, he essentially says that if you were to combine the .45 Army Colt with the penetration of the Mauser 7.63, you would have a weapon that would penetrate armor well. At the time, they did have the technical skill to make some truly outrageous kinds of armor. As an example, the Brewster armor protected the head and chest. It was 0.21 inch thick and weighed 40 pounds. When this armor was angled at 35 to 45 degrees, it could deflect what seems to be .30-06 ammunition shot from a Lewis machine gun. The caliber of the machine gun was not explicitly mentioned, but since the testing was done in America and we have the velocity of the ammunition, I believe it was 30-06. What I did gather about the armor of this era is that they seem to be designed to stop 45 ACP ammunition at close range. They also seem to be sold for about $100 back then, which would be about $1,800 in today's money. The ones that the Army was working on were 7.5 pounds for a small man or 10 pounds for a large man. Even if your vest could only stop a 45, that would still give both the gangsters and the police of this era a significant advantage, considering that low penetration weapons like shotguns loaded with buckshot and Thompsons were prolific and consistently used by both sides. However, if someone like Clyde Barrow starts carrying around a shortened BAR, there isn't much cover around that could stop that kind of bullet, and body armor certainly isn't going to do that either. At least some of the body armor of this era was made out of overlapping plates of steel held within a canvas vest. This design was certainly useful in improving the mobility of the wearer. However, the downside of such a system is that the plates can become shifted out of their place and cause the wearer to become vulnerable. The head salesman of a body armor company received a slight wound during a live fire demonstration because of this problem. Obviously, you can create more of an overlap between the plates and use larger, fewer plates to help solve this problem. Now for the next part, the 357 Magnum. The Wikipedia article for the 357 Magnum tries to portray it as an attempt for Smith & Wesson the company and Douglas B. Wesson to reassert Smith & Wesson as the leading manufacturer of firearms for law enforcement. Likewise, it tries to portray the 357 Magnum as a direct response to the 38 Super, which could penetrate through body armor and automobiles. I think both of these positions are misleading. First of all, Phil B. Sharp explains that the origins of the 357 Magnum started out when he experimentally was playing with an extra high-velocity 38 special load. In doing so, he recognized that there was value in using working pressures much higher than the recommended factory standards. Phil Sharp does take credit for the idea of a 357 Magnum cartridge, but he is clear that he does not want to be credited for the design of the gun or the resulting cartridge itself, although he helped to collaborate on the project in a minor way. It is Douglas Wesson that really deserves the credit for the creation of the 357 Magnum, even though the idea originally came from Phil Sharp. The Sharp type of flat-nosed bullet eventually used for the 357 Magnum was a modified Keith-style bullet. The Keith bullets were unsuitable for the 357 Magnum because they are generally cast oversize, and when properly sized they gave 50% greater bearing service to the bore than the Sharp type, named after Phil Sharp. Notice that there was no mention here by Phil Sharp that his intent was to create a cartridge for law enforcement or that would penetrate through metal. The natural consequence of making a high-velocity cartridge is that it can penetrate through more steel than a low-velocity cartridge of the same design. This is an early advertisement for the 357 Magnum in an American Rifleman magazine of April 1935. There is no mention whatsoever of the cartridge having an ability to penetrate through armor or automobiles. Likewise, this advertisement is not specifically appealing to law enforcement. Rather, it is simply emphasizing velocity and power. So it appears that armor penetration and penetration through vehicles was not a selling point of the 357 Magnum from the very beginning. At a somewhat later date of June 1935, Douglas B. Wesson himself wrote about the ability of the 357 Magnum to penetrate a 3/16 inch thick plate. He states that the standard 38 Special is without doubt the most popular cartridge among shooters in general and police departments. He goes on to explain that the most powerful and highest velocity handgun cartridge that they could find in the ballistic tables is a 38 Super cartridge with 480 foot-pounds of energy. However, he says no powerful handgun but the 357 Magnum could penetrate the 3/16 inch plate. I don't find it particularly impressive that this plate was penetrated, considering that in the previous video I mentioned a metal-capped Super X 38 Special round that went through 4/16 inches of steel. I think this is useful though because it tells us at least some of the body armor at this time seems to be made out of 3/16 inch thick steel. An extremely compelling reason to conclude that the 357 Magnum was not intended from the beginning specifically for penetrating through armor was the fact that the standard factory bullet was unjacketed and did not have a metal cap for barrier penetration. With both the 38 Super and the 357 Magnum, it appears that people have noticed that these cartridges can penetrate steel, and have made the assumption or inference that this property must be the result of the creator's intent to penetrate steel, and not just a natural consequence of increasing velocity. This logic is flawed, obviously. Another test involved shooting a Thompson into some bulletproof glass, and none of the rounds penetrated through. A single 357 Magnum round broke the glass but did not penetrate through. Finally, Mr. Wesson mentions another test involving a 357 Magnum and an extra heavy sample of bulletproof vests, which were used to prove that there is no such thing as a bulletproof vest that could be worn with the slightest degree of comfort or without being apparent to the casual observer. Essentially, what he is saying is that since the 357 Magnum has been invented, body armor has become obsolete because it would have to be too heavy to offer protection against the 357 Magnum. Obviously, this did not hold true into the modern era. If we look at the original finished product of both the 357 Magnum revolver and the ammunition, we find that the barrel was made 8 3/4 inches long, with the intent to give exactly 10 inches between front and rear sights. This is the maximum permissible distance in the any revolver shooting competitions at the time. This modern article states that Smith & Wesson originally believed that all 357 Magnums would have 8 3/4 inch barrels, as they would be only used for hunting. I think this claim is false, or at least misleading. Interestingly, a forum post states that in 1936, a dispute over the compliance of the 357 Magnum in USRA and NRA any revolver matches caused Smith & Wesson to establish the odd barrel length of 8 3/8 inches. It appears that there is a concerted and ongoing effort made to keep the 357 Magnum revolvers in compliance with competition requirements, while also giving the shooter the maximum advantage possible in a competition. It also appears that while the requirements for competition are strict, there are no strict practical requirements tied to a specific barrel length for hunting use. Instead, people at this time seem to prefer a somewhat shorter barrel length for hunting, but this may not be an absolute necessity to them. Because of this, I think it would be most appropriate to categorize the 357 Magnum as a handgun that was originally designed for competition and hunting, but was later adapted for other uses like law enforcement and self-defense. The action of gifting the first 357 Magnum to J. Edgar Hoover does suggest an attempt to appeal to a law enforcement market. Also in 1936, there was a demonstration where a secretary to a police director held a shield of shatterproof glass while she was shot at with the 357 Magnum and a 1911 pistol. She was not harmed by this test. There is a news article in 1926 about how the Queen of Romania had an armored car that was outfitted with 200 pounds of armor, and with this it could stop 45 ACP rounds. There was also a news story in 1937 about how Washington's police force was planning on getting an armored police car, but they canceled this purchase because of the invention of the 357 Magnum, which was capable of penetrating through said car. This article is a bit misleading because it makes it seem like the 357 Magnum was invented that very year, which was false because it came out 2 years prior. Regardless, it seems likely that armored cars were still being made only to stop 45 ACP rounds at the time. When metal-piercing loads came out for the 357 Magnum, that was also a game changer. An American Rifleman issue published in 1938, it mentions that a 357 Magnum metal piercer load was stopped in 1/4 inch mild steel at 15 yards. On Rock Island Armory's website, there is an example of a 357 Magnum revolver that was owned by one of the FBI's firearm experts, Special Agent Thomas Bowman. He sent the gun to Smith & Wesson to get the barrel shortened to 4 inches and to have a front sight attached to it that met his specifications. Many people today are now familiar with the Bowman front sight, which was obviously named after its creator. A 4-inch barrel is much more appropriate for law enforcement use, obviously, so it would make much more sense to do penetration testing with that, or other reasonably sized barrel lengths. Elmer Keith contributed to the 357 Magnum project as well, as mentioned before about the bullet design. He believed that for a concealed 357 Magnum used for fast self-defense work, a 3.5-inch barrel would be excellent. In the early days of the FBI, things were particularly lenient. You might be issued a 38 Special, 38 Super, or a 357 Magnum. You could also buy a gun of your own and carry it in the line of duty. If you chose to buy your own 357 Magnum, you could specify what barrel length you wanted and the gun would be essentially custom made for you. After the Second World in 1950, barrel lengths became standardized. The FBI tended to issue .38 special revolvers with 4-inch barrels. However, this barrel length requirement was later reduced to 3 inches before they adopted their last revolver, the Model 13 357 Magnum. So if we have a standard FBI-issued .357 Magnum with a 3-inch barrel instead of the unwieldy 8 3/4-inch barrel, we have greatly reduced the difference in power and velocity between the .357 Magnum and the .38 Super. Depending on what ammunition you are using, you may find that these two weapons are essentially equal in power, or that the difference in power between them is essentially not enough to make a difference. This pretty much defeats the point of the .357 Magnum in my opinion, because you are taking away the one attribute, power, that makes it different from most other calibers. It would obviously not be cost effective in the early days of the .357 Magnum to buy such an expensive revolver with such a short barrel when similar performance and higher capacity could be obtained with the cheaper .38 Super.